Thank you for asking me to come. Thank you to all of you who are here, including the students in Stephen's class. It's nothing better for me than to speak to students who are curious and interested in what we're doing. So thank you for being here. This talk will be about my show, The Double. I'm gonna lead us through that show, how it came about, what are the arguments, and I will briefly touch on my early show, what happened to the institutional critique along the way. But it's really focused on The Double show, which is up at the National Gallery for a few more weeks. It closes on October 31st, Halloween. If you're able to come down and see it, bus or train or whatever, I hope you'll consider doing so. It's a very special show for me, as you'll see. But before I talk about the show, I just wanted to say I've been a curator professionally for 12 years. And before that, I was a professor, as Dr. Madoff explained. But I brought to my curation, my curatorial work, a certain kind of set of practices that I learned as a professor, as a scholar. And I think they're relevant in terms of how I work. And I just want to say that for me, being a curator, an effective curator, the most important thing is to follow your intuition, your instincts, your imagination, to really think what really matters to me, what is driving me as a mind, as a thinker. What are my great enthusiasms? It's the same impulse that a scholar has or that an artist has, I believe a curator needs to have. At her best, the curator is really looking for what feels most urgent to her or to him or to them. What is one's intuition? But in order to do an effective exhibition, you need a lot of research behind that intuition. You need to really do a lot of exploring and digging and researching in order to come up with a show that's going to really hold together, that's going to be coherent, that's going to be effective. So I can't stress enough the importance of research, really researching and reading and looking, and the time that takes to produce effective exhibitions. And my last point would be that curation is about putting things in space. It's telling stories in space. And it's different from writing a book. I've done that too. It's like a book, which is a narrative. You're narrating a story through space. And so you have to really think about the space, the objects, the placement of things to tell that effective story in order to see through your narrative, your intuition, to bring it to life, to bring it into a clarity that will be effective for viewers. So intuition, research, narrative. Those are three, for me, binding concepts of my curatorial practice. And of course, that's what the curator, I feel, should do. But then the curator works in a particular place, a set of parameters we each do in our lives. And for curators, the question is, what are the resources available to me? Financial, spatial. Am I working in a space with a climate that is suitable for certain kinds of fragile objects? Do I have the money to do what I need to do? If I don't have enough money, how do I work within those parameters? If I don't have enough space, how do I adjust my ideas to this particular space? These are sort of this is the point at which your intuition, your research, your storytelling abilities meets institutional parameters and limitations, and you have to work within them. That sounds rather practical. You probably know this already, but my experience has taught me that I have to work again and again within each situation that I'm privileged enough to work in, whether it's a small gallery in Soho, or the National Gallery of Art. Each situation has a set of parameters, financial, spatial, and so on, that you have to adjust your ideas to. So with that, I'm going to show you some slides. And I'm going to lead you through The Double. So The Double, identity and difference in art since 1900. How did this come about? Well, it was an intuition. I think I've been thinking about two-ness for a long time, and maybe after I put up the show, I realized, oh, I've got two older brothers and they're close in age, and I was the third, and I was down the hall, and I was outside of their very particular thing. I was the third to their double, to their pair, to their quasi-twinness. In fact, some of the artists in the show, like Anne Truitt, are the siblings of actual twins. So I think I've been sort of thinking about two-ness for a very long time, intuitively, but it really comes out of my research that Professor Madoff sort of mentioned, including minimal art and post-minimalism, as we'll see. So the double identity and difference in art since 1900. I first started to write on the double in 2002, an essay on Eva Hesse. I'll talk about Eva Hesse in a minute. But I first started to work on the show when I came to the National Gallery from my job at Emory. So I've been working on this for 12 years, okay? So it's taken 12 years to see this through. Other things came along, other shows that were mentioned, but I came back to the double. And at the very start, my intuition told me, okay, this is a vast phenomenon. It's huge, the double is huge. How are you gonna make a show about this? And I came up with this 4-part structure very intuitively in 2010, and it fell into place, and I've stayed with it ever since. My intuitions, I thought, turned out to be right for my show. And the 4 parts of the show are, first of all, seeing double, like the Jasper Johns flags. It's the same form repeated. And that seems easy or obvious, but actually it's deeply complex when you paint a motif twice or you repeat a form, a sculptural form. Of course, that puts the issue forth of identity and difference. Once you repeat something, you've got something else, and it looks perhaps a lot alike or exactly like the first term, but it's not. There's difference between those two things. And I called that section Seeing Double. The next section is called Reversal. The Glenn Ligon Double America represents reversal. So that's when you have a form that has been inverted, it's upside down, it's the negative of a positive, it's reversed. So it's the opposite of the thing and its opposite, it's reversal. The third section's Dilemma. And that was really intuitive, and I struggled to figure out the dilemma idea. There are many ways of speaking about the question of choice, of non-choice, of two terms where you're asked to look at them and compare them, and there's a kind of lack of resolution. There's a kind of tension, a dilemma, a non-choice, an impossibility between these two things. There are many ways of speaking about dilemmas, different sort of ideas of dilemmas, one of which is the double bind. And Gregory Bateson, who was a psychologist and a communications theorist, came up with this idea of the double bind back in the 60s. And it's essentially when a child is confronted with contradictory messages from the parent. And according to him, it produces psychological problems for the child if you're always getting mixed messages. The novelist Joseph Heller came up with the term catch-22 in a famous novel about a kind of impossible choice. I call it dilemma. Dilemma seemed most open of the terms for speaking about this question of choice and non-choice. And finally, the self, the divided and doubled self. Split selves, personae, when an artist adopts a persona, an alter ego. Shadows, twins, my sister, my brother is a section about twins. And finally, the pair, which is two people. It's a bit open-ended, but it's pretty much a queer gallery about same-sex couples, collaborators, but there are straight artists in that section as well. So pairs of individuals. So the show has a narrative that is both initially very specular, perceptual, seeing, and the double is about seeing, and the fact that we are binocular beings with two eyes that reconcile to retinal images to produce a sense of greater depth. That's what our vision does. That's what it achieves. So perception is all very much central to the show, and the art of doubling forces us to see ourselves seeing as we look back and forth between two forms or images. And that is the sort of the central thrust of the first section. But the show becomes increasingly conceptual when you're, reversing things or inverting things in your mind, or you're forced to make choices between two things, dilemmas. Conceptual, and finally, the show is very psychological. It's about the self. It's about me, myself, as a self, and also me and another, me and you. So perceptual, conceptual, psychological. So that's the narrative of the show, these 4 sections that start off seemingly rather straightforward, the same thing repeated, increasingly complicated, ending up very psychological about the self. I see identity as much an issue for things as it is people. We hear a lot about identity these days. We're in a period of identity politics of all sorts. But my show really asks us to think about identity as well as personally as very abstractly, to think of identity abstractly and philosophically. The difference between one thing and another is a question of identity as well. And the difference between things and the sameness between things is an abstract philosophical problem as it is an identity problem. And you'll note also that the show tells the story 4 times chronologically. So the modernist double in that first section, it suggests that we're always starting off in 1900, around 1900, and we end up with contemporary art 4 times over. So that's the story that I developed pretty early on intuitively, but then I had to figure out what to do. How do I tell this story? Which objects do I include? How do I create a show about this idea of the double? That's the layout of the show. If you come to see it, you'll walk, starting off with the bottom left with the Robert Morris 2 columns and the Josiah McElhenney sculpture you'll see. You walk downstairs, you end up at Jasper Johns' Flags and Glenn Ligon's Double America. You walk through seeing double, that section. You are still in that section when you see a section about time, temporal doubling, then move into reversal, then into the dilemma, then to the section of the self, the divided self, the personae, the shadow, the twins, and the pairs. So here we are at the very start with the Robert Morris 2 columns and the Josiah McElhenney 2 walking mirrors. Those are performed works. The mirrors with wood are donned by dancers, and they follow a line that Josiah McElhenney drew on the floor of the East Building of the National Gallery, and they follow one another around very, very slowly. They face the mirrors from behind, that is to say, they cannot see ahead. They have to look down onto the lines in the floor to proceed, which they do slowly around the Robert Morris double columns. The Robert Morris column was initially a performative work as well. He toppled one of those columns to the floor with his body during a performance in 1961. So this question of the body is very essential to the show. The question of performance is stated from the start. And also generations of artists. I often think about generations. So here you have Robert Morris, who passed away a few years ago, and Josiah McElhenney, who's very much active right now. Jasper Johns is in his 90s, Glenn Ligon is mid-career. So this question of generations, of dialogues between 2 artists is stated up front as well. That's a sub-theme of the show. Now, the double isn't new. And, I struggled to think about, what am I doing? This is not new. And in fact, I knew the Chumley ladies, who actually it's thought to be were sisters. That wonderful painting in the Tate from the early 1600s. I thought about that for years, and that doubling is not new. And it's not just a Western concept, it's Eastern, it's Nigerian. These Ibeji are twin effigies, statuettes made in Nigeria in Yoruban society to mark the birth of twins. And there was a lot of incidents of child mortality in the 19th century when this form was developed. And so when one of the children died, the the remaining living twin would look after the effigy of their dead sibling. So the double is not confined to Western art. It's not confined to art since 1900. It's old, it's very old. It's in ancient folklore, it's in mythology. Think of Narcissus, think of Echo. It's in Shakespeare, lots of doubles and twins and mixed identities. It's in Mark Twain, it's in romantic literature. Think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Think of William Wilson by Edgar Allan Poe, this narrator who has an alter ego with the same name. It's prevalent, you know, throughout cultures and history. And it's an old master painting like this Savaldo, the man, the warrior in his mirror. That image, that kind of format of the mirrored self gets taken up by Brazai in the 30s, and that Brazai is in our show. It's in 19th century photography, particularly amateur photography, doubling a figure, Guibert photographing Toulouse-Lautrec, modeling for himself. Well, this Samuel Fosso, Central African Republic artist, is in the double show, and that's Fosso and a friend. Different techniques. That's a photo, an actual photo on the right of two friends sitting side by side. The Guibert is a double exposure on a single plate. But it's not new. And it was really post-minimal art that led me to the double. And so Professor Madoff talked about my work on minimalism, my books on minimalism. That was my beginning as a scholar. But I quickly got very interested in the so-called post-minimalists, artists like Eva Hesse, Robert Smithson, Mel Bochner. And I was very interested how these artists who are working in the mid-late 60s are exploring two-ness, what I call two-ness or doubling. Eva Hesse, one more than one, metronomic irregularity. These works of Hesse I wrote about, you know, back in 2002, and I start to talk about them as a kind of dilemma structures. That in metronomic irregularity number one, you have the strict order of the grid of each panel, 254 little holes. But then she threads between those holes, those cotton cover wires that kind of go back and forth, and you can't tell where one begins and ends. So there's both order, that is to say metronomy, and disorder, irregularity, combined in the same work. And Eva Hesse, in a late interview, said that she had learned from Jackson Pollock that you could have order and disorder in the same work. And so that really interested me, the way she's thinking about two terms in her work in very complicated and fascinating ways. And I call artists who are really obsessed with the double, doublers. That's my informal name for artists like Eva Hesse, like Marcel Duchamp, like Boetti, like Warhol, like Ronnie Horn, and Gonzalez Torres. They are artists who really are obsessed with two-ness. Other artists you'll see just make one major double. Rauschenberg, Gorky, they aren't doublers throughout their careers, but they make something very decisive that enlists the double in a work. Smithson was another very important person for me. I wrote an essay about Eva Hesse and Robert Smithson. It was called The Logic of the Double. And they were friends. Eva Hesse saw the enantiomorphic chambers, which is also in my show. And I can't help but think it affected the way her thinking for her metronomic irregularity, these two terms with the kind of absence between. Because I was interested in minimalism, first of all, you know, minimalism tends to be an art about the one or the multiple. That is to say, the single object, like the Judd box, where you see everything together and it's one entity, or the multiple, the three, the several, the infinite, like in Dan Flaben's Nominal Three, 1, 2, and then 3 fluorescent bulbs. This sense of infinity, of multiplicity, one or multiple. There are very few doubles in minimalism, just that Robert Morris, 2 columns you saw, and an Anne Truitt that's in my show. Usually minimalism wants the one or the several. that really interested me, and I was really interested in what Robert Smithson is doing. He writes an article about Donald Judd in 1965, and Donald Judd commissioned the essay. And what does Robert Smithson write about Donald Judd's work that you see on the left, the pink plexiglass box? Smithson writes, "Downs are ups and ups are downs. An uncanny materiality engulfs the basic structure." So that downs and ups are downs. He's thinking of this as both up and down, as reversed, as unstable. And he makes this enantiomorphic chambers that year. Enantiomorphy means opposition. It's based on the idea of two crystals that are absolutely opposed in form, they're symmetrical, but our ears are enantiomorphs, and our hands are enantiomorphs. They are the same form, but they're absolutely opposite. If you rotate it one form onto the other, it's not the same. And that's what Smithson tried to do in this double mirrored relief. They are absolutely reversals of one another. The mirrors face one another, and when you stand between them, you look to the left, you stand to the right, and you are a split self. It divides your subjectivity in two. So Smithson's very interested in doubling and reversal, and he's reading Donald Judd as a reversal of itself. That really interested me, what these younger artists are doing to minimalism, and how they were starting to really look back to other artists like Rauschenberg and Johns and Warhol, and past Judd, and past Carl Andre, and past Morris. So this is this first section seeing double. And, with the great chocolate grinders of Duchamp, and there are 9 Duchamps in the show. The most works by any artist in the double show are Duchamp, they're 9. And I was really interested in these chocolate grinders. They're really breakthrough paintings and how they are the same motif, but one has chiaroscuro shadowing, the other he gets rid of the shadow, and he creates a sense of kind of artificial depth through those lines on the drums, those very shiny orthogonals. They're made of thread. When you walk up to the work, you see that he actually learned to sew to make those lines. So it's the same image, but they're totally different. And the whole theme of vision and perception and binocularity is something he explores a lot. We have all these works in the show, including the stereoscopic card. Stereoscopy, as you know, was a 19th century invention. That's a stereoscopic viewer on the left. And essentially it's 2 photographs on a card side by side. One is slightly different than the other. And when you look at them through a stereoscope, they look really deep, like you're looking into deep space. And so a stereoscope really makes you aware of your binocularity and of the act of sight. So I have a whole vitrine of these perceptual experiments by Duchamp and his collaborator Man Ray. But also the theme of the ready-made. You all know the ready-made of Duchamp, the found object that he then adjusts or leaves as itself and declares it a work of art. And so the whole question of the ready-made and the copy, the original and the copy. The Apollinaire enameled on the left is the original. He's adjusted a sign for Sapelin enamel paint. It's now a pun on the poet Apollinaire's name. And the little girl is an allegory of the artist painting. And then he reproduces that in 1965 as an older artist in an edition of 8. So I have both of these side by side, the original and the copy, the first and the double. But of course, the double is a multiple in this case. There are 8 of them. And so one of the interesting discoveries for me is the porosity of the double, its instability. It's the one more than one, as Eva Hess calls it. It's the beginning of the multiple. The double is the beginning of the multiple, but it's also not the several yet. But it easily slips into the multiple. In the case of this Duchamp reproduction, suddenly the double is multiplied. So that's an interesting question, is the double is its own thing, but it has a relationship to the one and to the several in interesting ways. So I have Duchamp facing Matisse, and as you know, they were the 2 sort of founding or figures of modernism for the United States. They were both very much featured in the famous, notorious Armory show of 1913. Paintings by each of these artists were the big scandals of the show that introduced modernism to the United States. But in narratives of 20th century art, they become divided. And the critic Clement Greenberg, you may have heard of, the famous critic of modernism, sees modernism as a narrative of painting, of great painting, from Manet to Picasso to Matisse to Jackson Pollock, increasing sort of interest in flatness and the color and concerns of painting itself. Whereas Duchamp is the narrative for Greenberg of the Dada, of the avant-garde. It's the opposite of the narrative of modernism. My show puts these two narratives together, modernism and the avant-garde. So we have Matisse and Cubism, and Mondrian and Barnett Newman, modernist painters, side by side with the avant-garde, with Duchamp, with Magritte, with Malevich, with the Russians and the Dadists and so on. So they're all in one space. And what the show demonstrates is the double is interesting to modernists and avant-garde paint artists, that the double has no boundaries, no fixed boundaries. The double is unstable, it's unruly, and artists from all sort of veins of modernism and avant-gardism are interested in the double, from Matisse to Duchamp and back. This is a great combination. This is Mondrian making his double line paintings. But he learned about the double line from his follower, Marlo Moss. She's not very well known. She was a non-binary British artist who moves to Paris in the late 20s, hangs out with Mondrian's Circle of Abstraction Creation group, it was called, learns his style, makes Mondrian type paintings. But by 1931, she makes a double line. And that was forbidden. There was no double lines in Mondrian in his classic neoplastic style. It was usually one line and another line, vertical and horizontal, with his classic palette of red, yellow, blue, and gray and white. And the bottom right of his painting here is that style. With one line, it's more balanced against another. But what Marlo Moss does is she develops this double line. It was sacrilegious, and it changes everything. And he adopts the double line by 1932. And it changes his art entirely. His art becomes very optical, dynamic. It's no longer this restful, harmonious style of his earlier practice. So they are both doublers. He takes it from her, but she takes it from him. They're a pair. And it's a fascinating dialogue that really hasn't been reconstructed sufficiently in art history, in part because her art is very rare. A lot of it was destroyed and bombed, a bomb in World War II. But luckily I was able to get that from The Hague on the right, and one from the Art Institute in the same palette. Just imagine how long it took to get two works by these artists that would really allow you to see their similarity and therefore their difference, how different they are. When you look at these paintings, they're totally different. Let's see. Well, of course, the great Gorky paintings, the National Gallery painting on the right, the Whitney painting on the left, the self-portrait with his mother, who of course died in his arms in the Armenian Holocaust when he was a child, based on a photograph of them together before the Holocaust happened. A lot of debate about the two paintings. Is the National Gallery painting unfinished? Was he still working on it at the end of his life? The Whitney painting is cooler in tonality. The National Gallery is much more pastel-y. But if you look at the mother's face in the right painting, it's white like a death mask. So for me, the very pretty palette of pinks and oranges and purples, lavenders, offsets a very deathly image of the mother. She's much more vital in the left painting in the Whitney. A lot can be said about this, but it was a huge pleasure to bring these paintings together. They haven't been together since a retrospective in 2009. So one aspect of this show that made it very complicated is, and why it's not traveling, by the way, is because I had to bring two paintings or two sculptures together, often in different collections. Oftentimes these things were not meant to be shown together. Gorky never showed these together. Matisse made lots of pairs of paintings. He did not show them together. In a way, my construct is my construct. They made them doubly, but they didn't show them doubly. So these things are often in different collections. So I had to reunite works from different places, and it was a pretty complicated loan process. The post-war double has great works, Rauschenberg and Hess, Warhol, Schifano made the yellow painting on the left. There's Stella, Ronnie Horn at the end on the floor. The very famous double of Rauschenberg, Factum 1 and 2, which is often taught as, his critique of abstract expressionism, which was the dominant style in New York in the mid-1950s. And he repeats the gestures, the ochre brushstroke, the red brushstroke, the dripping, the black brushstroke, to sort of make an abstract expressionist painting twice, and to perhaps demonstrate that it had become a rather rote exercise by the late 50s. All the young artists were making, paintings like de Kooning, Franz Klein, Joan Mitchell, and so on. But these works are far more complicated than that simple reading. Two photographs on the top of Eisenhower, two photographs of a burning building, a pair of trees on a calendar image. And so these works have what I call internal doubling. That is to say, there's doubling within the image that affects the whole, and they are doubling of the whole image twice. So they're very complicated and wonderful works, and as you see, owned by separate museums. For the sake of time, I won't talk about everything. I'd love to, I could go on, but I won't. So when I was young, postmodernism was dominant as a theory and as a practice. And really the major case study in the seminars I attended was Sherry Levine's work and her work, which was called Appropriation. And that is to say, she would, as would Richard Prince and others, appropriate an image from another source and declare it their own work of art. So she photographed this very famous photograph by Walker Evans, from a book. So it's a photograph of a reproduction of a photograph, which is itself printed from a negative. And so Levine, has not been shown with Walker Evans before. This pair has never been shown, even though it's a classic case study of art history, to sort of reunite these two things, to force you to look at the difference between the Levine, which is actually smaller. In order to make it enough resolved as an image, she had to print it smaller. It's darker in reality than the Walker Evans. And I was able to think about postmodern appropriation within a longer arc of doubling. That is to say, you see it in Duchamp, you see it in all kinds of artists. And so the postmodern appropriation has a history. And postmodernist painting is in the show. Jacqueline Humphreys doubling an image. She painted these two paintings on the left simultaneously, and so did Rauschenberg. He painted his factums simultaneously. Whereas the French painter Bernard Pifaretti paints one side of the canvas first and then the other from memory. So there's a temporal succession in the Pifaretti, whereas in the Humphreys, they're absolutely simultaneous. So the theme of time is very important for the double. There's often a difference, a temporal difference between one image and form and another. And so I have a whole gallery about temporal doubling, as I call it. This was an interest in that book that Dr. Madoff mentioned, The Art of Return, about the 60s and contemporary art, where I was looking at a lot of reenactment of events from the 60s and 70s in the 2000s, and how these works caused you to think of two moments in time, two moments in history simultaneously. And Mark Tribe, who teaches at SVA, he made works like this, which I also discuss in my book, reenactments of 60s events that cause us to think of two moments in time together. Or in this case, in this Wallace Berman from the 60s, a single moment split in two. The shooting of Oswald by Ruby, Oswald, the assassin of John Kennedy, is split in two by the doubling of the detective next to him. So the Reversal Gallery has that Smithson that you know, Bochner. Let's see what else we got here. Yes, incredible Man Rays. Let's see. And the theme of reversal is announced from the very beginning in that Josiah McElhenney, where the viewer is reversed in her or his reflection from the very beginning. The Man Ray, I said the double is porous, it's unstable, and a lot of these works could have been in different sections. I mean, as a curator, you have to decide, well, what's going to go where? So this could have been in the divided self section. It could have been in the temporal section because, you know, there are these three instants. It's actually a triple exposure of moments in this work, but I put it in reversal because I was able to get both the positive and the negative versions of this work from the Pompidou, which are just extraordinary. And you'll note that they're on this black wall in the show. They are printed on film, on cellulite. And so they had to be lit from behind by a special light box. Something I didn't know until these things arrived from Paris. We had to develop a whole light system for this. There are quotations throughout the show, 6 quotations that are relevant to the double. Lewis Carroll, Through the Looking Glass, the great narrative of reversal. Janine Antoni's Mom and Dad, where she reverses her parents' genders. And Dilemma. That gallery is the smallest of the show. It's actually a large gallery, but it's only one gallery because there were fewer Dilemma works to show, whereas there are lots of works in the first section and the final section on the self. The Dilemma gallery is a bit just, there are fewer examples that I could show. It's a complicated idea, but look at the works in this gallery. Duchamp's door, the door that he stationed between two doors, one leading to his bathroom on the left, the other to his kitchen. He got rid of the two doors in the corner and had the carpenter put just one in the middle. So if you shut it one way, the other room is open. So it's never a satisfactory solution. The Gonzalez Torres, it's Felix Gonzalez Torres's only double stack. And one text says, somewhere better than this place. The other says, nowhere better than this place. So the viewer can choose one or two or neither. So it's the one work in the Dilemma gallery. It's a dilemma, but you can choose. But there are lots of works that deal with color, like the Frank Stella that you see at the top right, Jasper's Dilemma, named for Jasper Johns. 2 beautiful prints by Johns on the left, in the same, one in color, the other in black, white, and gray on the same plate. Stella puts the systems of color and value of hues and black, white, and grays side by side in a kind of irreconcilable dilemma. And by the way, the Stella is a reversal. They are the reverse direction of one another. So it's both a reversal and a dilemma. There's the Eva Hess, you know, her friend Mel Bochner, next to her. Renee Green, this terrific early Renee Green, Color One, where you have 2 texts. One is a text from a 19th century African-American author, Francis Watkins. The other on the right is F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby. They are both citations of these novels, 2 different authors, one from the 1880s, one from the 1920s. They're both about race. They're both racist texts with the N-word. And in between are paint chips that Renee Green found in a paint shop with their actual names, which are very racialized, exoticized, and gendered. sort of color names. So it's very much thinking about color and identity and associations with color. And finally, the section where identity comes to the fore, that is, say, human identity, the divided self gallery, with really remarkable works, photographs, prints, paintings. Let's see. And so it was mentioned I did this show in 1993. And so that was my first show. Just imagine, it's, how long is that? That's almost 30 years ago. I guess I'm getting old. So, but it was a wonderful show. It was called What Happened to the Institutional Critique. And it had artists like Tom Burr, Greg Bordowitz, Mark Dion, Andrea Fraser, Renee Green, Zoe Leonard, Christian Philip Muller, three of whom went to the SVA, by the way, studied at your school, and had gone to the Whitney Independent Study Program, several of them. And I met them at that point when I'm living in New York and teaching at SVA, actually. I only bring this up right now because you'll see that that word identity appears in the table of contents. The show had several themes and implications, but one of which was identity. And in 1993, the Whitney Museum held their biennial. It was curated by Elizabeth Sussman. It's the most famous biennial probably of the past 50 years. And it was a multicultural biennial and quite groundbreaking. It was very inclusive. But there was this idea that here is a gay artist and his work is about being gay. And here is a Black artist and her work is about Blackness. There was this kind of what I would call a tautology of identity and art, a reflectionism of identity and the work. And my show was against that. My show saw identity in far more complicated, fraught terms. The self is divided, is tangential, is split. So this has been going on in my work, this interrogation of identity, since 1993. And perhaps one reason it was so important to me is I was an AIDS activist. I was part of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, in which people from all kinds of backgrounds and identities were involved with AIDS activism. It wasn't just one identity. It wasn't just a gay movement. It was really what we would call an intersectional movement. So the theme of identity has been with me from the very start. And I didn't really quite think about this until a grad student wrote a dissertation about queer identity in that period. And there's a whole chapter on this show. And I realized, oh yes, identity. I've been thinking about this for a while. We can look at these images later with the students. So divided selves in the double show, gay divided double selves, John's and the Mexican artist Guzman, the American artist Frank Moore. Personae, when an artist adopts an alter ego, a persona. The most famous example is Duchamp and his Rose C'est la Vie character. Rose signed the front, Duchamp signed the back of Fresh Widow. Very well-known works by Howardina Pindell, Free, White, and 21, where she performed the role of a white racist speaking back and forth with her own story as an African-American artist. Adrian Piper on the left, her character, the mythic being. The Shadow Wall, from Alfred Stieglitz to Andy Warhol. The Twin Wall, with works by Arbus and Fani Kayode from Britain, of Nigerian background, referring to those Ibeji sculptures you've seen, or Keita from Mali. The last gallery, The Pair, Gonzalez Torres, Gilbert and George, Jorge Maki from Argentina. He broke one sheet of glass with a hammer, the other he cut with a glass cutter over many months. You can't tell which is which. Lesbian images, Man Ray of Toklas and Stein, Harmony Hammond, and Samuel Fosso, he and his friend in the Central African Republic in the 70s. And Ronnie Horn's gold mats for Ross and Felix. They are a pair, both Ronnie Horn and Felix Gonzalez Torres are a pair, but also Gonzalez Torres and his partner Ross Laycock, who both died of AIDS, are sort of referenced in Ronnie Horn's beautiful gold mats, which are lit by the Gonzalez Torres lights, Lovers Paris, 1993. And the show began with the Ligon and the Johns in part because, of course, what's happening in this country and what's happening in Washington and this unbelievable divisions in our societies between parties, racial divisions, white nationalism returning, all these sorts of conflicts, these splits seem emblematized by the Ligon and the Johns. So that's it for the talk. Any thoughts anyone wants to put out there in our minutes that remain?
Hi, Professor Meyer. I do have a question.
Sure.
So I was wondering if Foucault's idea of similitude and resemblance play into your work, and how does that speak to the doubling? Similitude, Foucault proposed that it's like there's no hierarchical relationship, it can be reversed, and it kind of goes into infinity, whereas resemblance, there is a relationship of the original and a copy, and it is supposed to be like the and there is a representational relationship. The copy is supposed to represent the original, whereas in a similitude, you cannot tell which is representing which. And I was wondering if you consider a lot of the doubling here, the double works here, to be similitude or resemblance, or a little bit of both.
That's interesting. Which Foucault? Are you talking about the order of things? Are you talking about his discussion of the Renaissance episteme or the classical episteme? Which Foucault?
Yes, so Foucault wrote about the order of things, but mostly it's in the discussion, and this is not a pipe about, he wrote about Magritte's painting. So yeah, I'm really intrigued about that distinction he made, and also I guess the whole representational relationship is the things that he want to break from in the order of things. So I was trying, I'm really interested in seeing how that connect to the double concept in your exhibition.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that these semantic distinctions between ways of speaking about sameness and difference, resemblance or similitude, it would be very interesting to think about how the double show negotiates that. The first title of the show, if this answers anything, was Resemblance and Difference in Art since 1900. Resemblance. So it was, for me, about things looking like one another, and yet not looking like another, the difference. I ultimately settled on the word identity instead of resemblance. It seemed to me more apt ultimately for what the show is about allowing one to move from questions of resemblance and or similitude, however one wants to parse that, to questions of the self, which the show does achieve. That identity, putting that word up front, has the question of the self there from the beginning. By the way, there is a whole literature on identity and difference, a vast literature, from Plato to Heidegger and beyond. And I would say my show perhaps is unpacking that can of worms a bit more than just questions of resemblance. But I would tell you, Ivy, I like your question a lot. I would say that, again, I arrived at this very intuitively. And so The Order of Things, which I've read The Order of Things, and I've read This Is Not a Pipe, and they're wonderful texts. But they weren't really particularly germane for what I was trying to do.
Great, thank you for that. I really liked how you connect doubling to the identity and the self. And I guess I have another question. And so I see the technique of repetition or doubling also appear in a lot of surrealist photography, and I was wondering, what do you think it's like? Is it what is it that about the doubling that's that you found is germane or suited for the surrealist photography? Is that idea of doubling where the same person cannot exist twice in the same space that creates a sense of absurdity? Or is there something else? And is that something that you address in this exhibition regarding to like identity and the absurdity of double identity or something like that?
That's a great question. So there were two art historians kind of helped me out with that question of surrealist photography and the double. Mm-hmm. The first would be the photo historian Clément Charroux, who's been at MoMA for the past 2 years. He's moving on to another position, but he's a wonderful photo historian. And he has a book called Avant l'Avant-Garde, Before the Avant-Garde. It's in French. And he argues that in the 1880s and 90s, amateur photographers, like the Maurice Guibert person who took the photograph of Toulouse-Lautrec that you saw, were experimenting. Finally the handheld camera was available as a technology. You didn't need a tripod, and you could just take photos in an amateur way, and there were amateur photo clubs. It was this new technology, and they made lots of mistakes. And including exaggerated shadows and exaggerated mirror reflections and double exposures and montages, that a lot of these techniques were discovered accidentally by amateurs. And that in the 1920s, the avant-garde movements of photographers, and that's surrealism, yes, but it's also Russian constructivism, Rodchenko, and it's in Russia. Stepanova, I have a collage in my show by Stepanova, that they adopt these techniques that are first discovered by amateurs in the 1880s and 90s. They formalize them as aesthetic techniques, and in order to double the self and split the self, and it becomes this conscious aesthetic strategy. The other art historian that's very helpful, particularly for what you're asking, is Rosalind Krauss, and she wrote an essay called About Surrealism in Photography in the 1980s, and it's in that essay, as well as the art historian Craig Owens. Remember that name, Craig Owens. His first or second essay was called Photography en Abîme. And he was Krauss's student, and together wrote these essays about photography and doubling, in which they theorize sort of how the photograph as a medium is inherently doubled. It's the positive is the print of a negative, that doubling and photography go hand in hand. And one of my arguments is that the double in photography, the photography makes possible the double in modern art, the proliferation of the double in modern art. You need photography to have so much doubling. Anyway, Owens and Krauss argue this, and Krauss particularly explores surrealist photography. And she uses the word doubling to talk about surrealist photography, about the Man Ray that I showed you, for example, the Marchesa de Casati. And she interprets it through post-structuralist theory, particularly Jacques Derrida. You may have heard of Derrida and his very famous essay, Difference, in which he argues that temporal difference inhabits language, as well as spatial difference in language. And Krauss takes up that idea of difference and time and spatial difference, and she calls that doubling, and she says that photography, particularly surrealist photography, the double proliferates in surrealism. And she uses Derrida's notion to think about that. But I might add, for example, that another precondition of the double in modern art is the discovery of psychoanalysis, of Freud. And Freud, by discovering the unconscious, as he says, this person that is not me, sees the self schematically as split, as doubled. And that, of course, Freud's influence on surrealism was vast. But there are many avenues of research to pursue there. I think one could take those essays and explore further. Suggestive as Krauss's work is, it hasn't fully answered the question about the imbrication of surrealist photography and the double. But her essay and the Craig Owens essay really inspired my show as well.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing all these sources. By the way, I'm taking Minimalism with Brendan Joseph. So we use your book as the textbook.
Uh-oh. Any other thoughts or questions?
You can write them in chat if you want as well. Okay, so there is one in chat, James. A
Curatorial process. Can you read it out loud?
Sure. A curatorial process question. At what point in the 10 years of research did you begin to reach out with your idea? And what did that look like? How did you identify the National Gallery as your ultimate space for this show? And how did that affect your work from there?
Okay, I'll try to answer that. So I developed the show for the National Gallery. It was always for the National Gallery. I was an employee of the gallery when I developed the idea for a show. And how that affected things, I would say mostly positively. The fact that it is a museum with great space, great staff, and a lot of clout, allowing me to borrow these incredible works, made this show possible. It really is a National Gallery show. I don't think many museums could do a show like this in terms of having the space, the staffing, the installation staffing, but also the institutional muscle to get both Gorkys, to get this Mondrian and to get exactly what I wanted. So it's for the National Gallery. It's almost a site-specific show, if you will, and it's not traveling. And for various reasons, COVID got in the way. Other museums didn't have any money to bring a show like this, but also bringing those loans together for a second or third venue, it'd be very, very challenging. So yeah, it's a National Gallery show. And maybe the front room that you're seeing of the Ligon and the Johns, about American society, that's a National Gallery kind of work or installation. That's for Washington. That's a statement about what's happening in that very city right now. In terms of how much of the show is pulled from the collection, somebody is asking, Eve Shillow, thank you for that question. Gosh, maybe 10%. Yeah, there's some great highlights, the Gorky, there's a Magritte, there's this Ligon, and a lot of the photos are from our great collection of photography. But I would say most of it's the lone show. And that's another question. It's not a cheap show, and thanks to the support of my supervisors, the director, and so on, resources at this place, I could get these loans. It was also a financial question.